The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Our guest today is Myra Cohn Livingston, author of Poetry for Children and winner of the 1994 Curlin Award. This award is presented annually by the Children's Literature Research Collection at the University of Minnesota. Ms. Livingston will be interviewed by Lois Ringquist.
Welcome, Myra. We're delighted to have you here with us today.
Well, I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, good. It seems a given that every writer loves to read. Did you read as a child?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. A lot.
What were some of your favorite books?
Oh, I think Hans Christian Andersen, some of the fairy tales, the folk tales, poetry. My mother read a great deal of poetry to me, so I think it was probably inevitable that I should want to write in a certain rhythm, too. Mm-hmm. I remember disliking Alice in Wonderland. And later on, I think I found out why. I don't think I had a sense of humor as a child.
Uh-huh.
And I was kind of scared about her falling down the rabbit hole, and I really didn't get the humor of Alice, which is too bad. But I think I was not unlike some other children.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Has anything that you read as a child influenced you as an adult, do you think?
Oh, I definitely think so. I definitely think so. I think that rhythm has influenced me, the beauty of words, probably the beauty of language, and the beauty of books, of some books, because I was always drawn to magnificent books with wonderful smelling paper and beautiful bindings, lovely illustrations. I remember I had a Cinderella with the Millicent Sowerby illustrations. And then I had a number of books that the Petershams had done. And I remember, this is an interesting thing, because in Mickey, there is a page spread, you might remember, where Mickey's out on the plains in Hungary, and he has painted a night sky full of all these wonderful stars. And I think I fell in love with the stars because of that, and I had a third grade teacher who would give us blue paper and gold stars. And then when Leonard did space songs and sky songs for me in my own books and has these skies full of stars, I just sort of melted. It was like I was a child again looking at these wonderful skies.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
But you didn't start out to be a writer. You were a professional musician when you were 13.
Well,
what happened to change?
Well, I started out, I always liked to write. I started writing when I was very young, as soon as I could write, and I started playing the French horn when I was 11. But I think what happened eventually was, although I played professionally, I played the horn for many years, when I got to college, there was no orchestra at college. And I also started writing poems that were sold when I was a freshman in college. So, we always sort of stick to what we do best, plus the fact that unless you play the horn 3 or 4 hours a day, you lose your embouchure, you lose your lips. So I sort of let music drift away, although music is very much a part of my life now and always has been, always will be, although I don't play the horn anymore.
You said you began writing almost as soon as you could write. Mm-hmm. Did you start writing poetry right away?
Yes. Actually, my mother has some things that I would come in and say something to her, and she'd write it down for me, because, of course, I couldn't write it down.
Wow.
But I loved, in school, I always loved to write, and I would write stories. I remember in the 4th grade we were supposed to do a report on Christmas. I wrote a play instead. I wrote a play about Christmas in Sweden. I knew nothing about Christmas in Sweden, except it was probably the beginning of my research in life. How do you find out about Christmas in Sweden?
Well, if you ever want to go back to the play, you can come here and research at the American Swedish Institute.
Absolutely. I think, well, I was in Omaha then. I wasn't too far, but I didn't know about it.
Eons ago, an elementary teacher taught me that poetry was a collection of words written in rhythm with lines ending in rhyme. How do you describe poetry, or how do you define it?
Well, I don't think you can define poetry, Lois. I just don't think you can do that. I think what you do is, the nearest I've ever been able to come to what I think poetry is, let me put it this way, is what T.S. Eliot says in Burnt Norton. And he says, music heard so deeply that it is not heard at all, but you are the music while the music lasts. Ooh. And I like that so well. To me, that is what poetry, if there has to be any definition, and it's not a definition, that is as near as I can come to what poetry means to me. Because certainly not all lines rhyme, not all poetry rhymes. There are a lot of people who don't pay any attention to rhythm today. There are so many schools of poetry. There are those like Charles Olson that a line is a single breath. Everybody has their whole ideas. There's syllabic verse, there is classical verse of all kinds. But to me, poetry must have music. If it doesn't have music, if it only has image, or if it's confessional, kind of, that is not real poetry to me. But then everybody responds to a different kind of poetry.
Well, you yourself use so many different forms.
Mm-hmm.
The one that surprised me, I think, most was concrete poetry, which seemed to be an oxymoron. Would you explain what the term means?
Well, I think people know it as pattern poetry or concrete poetry. It's poetry that has a certain shape to it. Perhaps I don't think I've done more than, out of maybe 1,000 poems I've written, that maybe I have more than 10 of those poems. Because sometimes they lend themselves to it. In a poem I wrote, one of the first poems I wrote when I was a freshman in college, called Buildings. Buildings are a great surprise, everyone's a different size, and then the words would go, offices grow long and high, tall enough to touch the sky. So that became a long office, and then houses seem more like a box made of glue and building blocks, which was sort of square like a house. And it just happened that way. And a few other times I have managed to do that. But I never go into saying, now I'm going to write a concrete poem, any more than I say I'm going to write a certain kind of poem. If I'm going to write a funny poem, I probably will think about a limerick. But
I remember in Whispers, your first poem that was that you wrote when you were in college. Isn't there one about sliding where you actually poem slides downhill?
That's right. But that poem was written as an exercise in repetition. I was told to write a poem in repetition, so it was we can slide down the hill or down the stair or down the street. Or good thing I have hands, isn't it? Or anywhere.
For a lot of people, poetry is very serious, meaning-filled. You've given a hint that maybe that's not always the way it is?
Well, lots of people think of poetry as beauty, truth, and wisdom, with capital B, capital T, and capital W. And they look for messages. They look for deep messages in poetry. Poetry, I happen to teach at UCLA, and I have a class in writing poetry. And the one thing that I say over and over and over again till all my students want to scream is, poetry shows, it doesn't tell. Tell belongs to the encyclopedia. Showing an image so that the reader gets the message that's coming out is what counts to me in good poetry. That the poet has a voice, a definite voice that looks at something in a particular way. The lesson of haiku is a very good lesson, which is simply to present something happening and allow the reader to take up the thought. Haiku means beginning phrase. And so if you have a haiku like, that duck bobbing down below the depth of the water has seen something strange. I, the haiku poet, am giving you a picture. It's up to you to take it up and decide what is it that the duck has seen that's strange. That's what a good haiku does. I think all poetry should do that. I think the poet's voice should paint something that the reader seizes and thinks, maybe that's an experience I'd like, or to make somebody see something in a new way. When James Reeves talks about the snail like a toppling caravan, I've never seen a snail since that I don't think about how he taught me to see it in a new way. Or Valerie Worth describes the surprised eye of a shrimp in an open safety pin. And I've never seen a safety pin since that I don't think about the way she's made me see it. A good poet will make you see something in a new way. That's a long answer to your question.
But it kind of answers my next question, which was, what's important about why is poetry important?
Well, I think for a lot of people it isn't. It's just not important. It's an unnecessary, stupid, metaphoric way of looking at the world. But to me, it's a way of enriching your vision of the world. I mean, we all go through life, and okay, this is this is a cup, and that's a piece of paper, and this is a book, but we take things so for granted in a way. If we can look at things in new ways and find excitement in them, looking at all right, there are clouds up in the sky. I think it was Natural History Magazine or Smithsonian this month that talked about this man who fell in love with clouds, and he's made his whole life looking at clouds. If you look at clouds and you see an elephant or you see the gods in Valhalla, your life is very enriched. I think poetry does the same thing for you, and it gives you lines that kind of help you along. Theodore Retke always says, "I learn by going where I have to go," or a line will come to you that will suddenly fit into your life and your life experience. Mm-hmm. Poetry, Stephen Spender says, lets us know that we are alone, but to be alone is universal. I kind of like that a lot.
Yes.
I kind of like that a lot. That we know as human beings we have to be alone, but that every other human being has times of sadness, of emotion. When I did a book, There Was a Place, I was trying to say to young people that the terrible pain I see them in schools where their parents have split or they're arguing in the home, and I was trying through that book to say, I know how you must be suffering, but there are other people who are suffering as much as you. You are alone, but there are other people who go through the same experience you do, and you don't have to read a whole huge novel like this to find it out.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, you have a fascination with words. Who ignited that interest?
I think my mother and father. My father was a reader. I never saw my father go to bed at night without reading, and my mother always read to me. Now, she was never a great reader on her own, but she read to me all the time. And I've always found words rather fascinating, yes.
When and where do you write?
Oh, anywhere. On an airplane, at home. I have Olympia here and Mac here. And the day after I got Mac, you know what I'm talking about, my Macintosh?
Oh,
the day after I got Mac 2 years ago, the next morning, Olympia, I was working on her, all of a sudden she flew all over. There was a gasket here and a spring there. She got very angry. I said, don't worry, I'll still use you. So I use the computer, I use the typewriter, I keep a journal. Actually, some of the things that I sent to the Curlin collection, I was a little embarrassed. I was looking through some of them yesterday, and I write in the backs of old pieces of paper. Sometimes I write in napkins, if that's, a paper napkin, if it happens to be around. So, or a match cover, whatever's near.
What did your children think of your writing? You have three.
I have three. Well, they really didn't realize that I was a writer until they began to read. In other words, until they saw the book. To them, reading them from a piece of paper was not a book. Mm-hmm. And so when my oldest was about 7 and I had dedicated one book to him, I think he sort of became proud of it. But they're sort of, I think also when they were young, they kind of resented the typewriter in a way. I mean, mother was working, and children don't like their mothers to work. They like them to be there to pay them attention, right?
So did any of them turn out to be writers?
Well, actually, yes. Two of my oldest son, very interested in classical music, did a lot of work on radio, PBS stations. My second son is with MCA, and he does a lot of writing. And my daughter is actually writing a book. She did a movie called Paris is Burning, a documentary movie, which some of you you may have heard about, and some people here have heard about it. And she's just written a new screenplay, and she is writing a book. So,
not far from the tree.
Well,
it's been said, obviously, you have a deep understanding of children. What sort of poetry, then, do you think that should be shared with children?
All poetry that's within their emotional and interest experience. I mean, I always say, Babette Deutsch always said that children, the great themes of poetry are love and death, and these are not themes for children. Well, I disagree with that. I think that love, not Marvell's love for his coy mistress, but a child's love for parents or uncle or a pet. And children certainly know about the death of family members, the death of their pets. So I think it's the way in which it's presented. It has to be presented in a language which they understand and about things which they understand.
Should there be poetry written just for children?
Well, there is.
I know there
should
is.
There be? I don't know. I don't know. There should be good poetry written for children. I mean, if you're talking about David McCord and John Ciardi and Eve Merriam and Lillian Moore and Valerie Worth and a whole group of people who write well, yes. But if you're talking about people who write little verses or bad doggerel for children, no, it shouldn't be done. And that's a legitimate complaint against there is a legitimate complaint against the versifier, because the versifier is somebody who tells, does not show. A versifier will say, oh, there's one, I have a favorite, I always quote it in my classes, mothers come in all sizes. Some are maxi, some are mini, some drive a car, some drive a taxi. You can maxi and taxi rhyme. You know,
obviously.
And this is just saying, well, here, children, I've got you in my grasp, and I want to tell you everything I know about everything, and everything comes out, and it's like a fact. There are not good images. Or there's what Ruskin calls the pathetic fallacy, where, you know, there's jolly Mr. Sun and lovely Mrs. Nature, and till you could.
Yes.
Yes. Barf is the word, I think.
Right. You've taught creative writing and poem making. You've even written books about it. Can anyone learn to write poetry?
Well, I think anybody can learn something about the craft of poetry. In other words, I can teach almost anybody how to write a limerick or how to write a couplet or a tercet or a quatrain or possibly a cinquain. I think it's also possible to develop sensitivity in people. You cannot teach anybody else to write. That is impossible. But you can do two things. You can develop their sensitivity, make them aware of seeing, touching again, being curious, listening, looking, not just, I should say seeing, not just looking. That you can do for people. But, and I have discovered that my students at UCLA, now I have 10 of my students are now publishing with major New York companies.
Wow.
And some of them, it's taken them quite a while. It's taken them maybe 5 or 6 years to reach that point, but they have worked hard. And hard work is part of the answer, too. It is.
All right. How can a parent or a teacher instill an appreciation for poetry in children?
Just read it. Read good poetry. If a child is read too well, that child will pick up the language. The problem is that it's not done. And some of our major TV shows are not giving children beautiful literature at all.
Oh.
They aren't at all. And this is a crime and a tragedy, I think. I really do.
Often people of color object to whites writing about them. In No Way of Knowing, Dallas Poems, you write with a black voice. What's been the reaction to that?
I haven't really had any reaction to it, any negative reaction to it. I think my friends in Dallas were a little upset I had written it. But other than that, you see, this is an old argument. Well, then how can a man write a novel and talk about women? Or how can anybody write anything except the class into which they were born, their own set, and their own family? I think that's one of the silliest arguments I've ever heard. So no, I don't go for that at all, and I don't think that's the right attitude. I think a writer or an artist embraces more than his own persona, in a sense, and feels about other people, can put himself into the skin, or can put herself into the skin of another human being.
Using the right word or the right phrase is so important, especially to a poet. Does that right word come easily, or do you work and rework?
It depends.
As you write?
Sometimes you can work a lifetime and not get a poem. There are a couple that I'm still not able to write. There are others that you might get almost immediately, and others that you labor and labor and labor over. And I think it depends on the day. I think a lot has to do with how you feel that day, whether you're in, whether you're with it. Some days you're not. Some days you're ready to take in and not give out at all. And other days you give out, and you're not ready to take in, which is one reason I do anthologies, too.
Well, if someone wants to see the creative process, they can go over to the Curlin collection where you've sent your manuscripts, right?
Yes,
And
I think so.
Look at that.
Well, I think, and not only mine, but there are many, many people who all work differently. This is something which is upsetting me today, that in the schools they're teaching a lot of children, this is how writers work. There's no one way writers work. Writers work in very, very different ways, on very different, with different materials. The way they put their work together is different. Some people outline, some people never outline. I did a book called The Child as Poet, which is what I consider my magnum opus, and I probably wrote chapter 19 first and then maybe chapter 3, and you know, I don't outline, I never have. It's sort of a feel, what do I want to write now? What is it? I mean, you have to do all your research, don't misunderstand, but.
Well, you have been awarded the 1994 Curlin Award for your contribution to children's literature and your manuscripts to the collection, so congratulations.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor.
It's one of a number of awards that you've won, however. The National Council of Teachers of English has given you an award, and Texas has given you an award, California. Which award was the most exciting and why?
I've never thought about that before. It never even crossed my mind. I think the most surprising award, if you want to know the most surprising, was when I wrote Whispers and Other Poems, and I got a telegram from the New York Herald Tribune saying, congratulations, you won something something in our spring honor, an honor book for our spring festival. I had no idea what they were talking about. I mean, it's just, I didn't know it existed.
Well,
but I think the NCTE and the Curlin are extremely meaningful to me. I really do. Because I think that I think the Curlin is a very, very special collection, and that the idea of having a place where one can go to do research into contemporary writers is a very important thing.
As you said, in addition to your own works, you've done a number of anthologies. Many of them, well, they all are collections from other authors. Why? You said...
Because I love to read poetry. I love to read poetry, and I think that that is the best way to introduce people to poetry. In other words, if you read a collection of mine, if you pick up a book of mine, which is I Never Told or Monkey Puzzle or The Malibu, those are all my poems. And perhaps the person who picks them up, I'm not saying you personally, but perhaps the person who picks them up doesn't happen to like the way I write. They might like the way that David McCord writes better, or Valerie Worth or Chiardi or somebody. But if they pick up an anthology, then they can look and they can see that there are maybe 50 or 60 poets represented. And they say, well, I like the work of Lillian Moore. So they can go to the library and get all Lillian Moore if they want. But that's a good introduction, because a good anthology may have 1 or 2 poems by Moore, 1 or 2 McCord, 1 or 2 de la Mare, whatever, 1 or 2 Lear. And in that way, you become introduced to a poet. I always talk about it, listening to the tune you wish to hear. Some of us, like very serious verse. We like verse written in dactylics, heavy da 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 da, and others like da 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 da. They like the light-hearted kinds of things.
Well, so many of the collections there are kind of series poems, like your family series. There are poems for mother, poems for father, poems for brothers, poems for sisters. There are the animals, cat, dogs, cat poems, dog poems.
Right.
I particularly like If You Ever Met a Whale.
Yes. Well,
now, when you make these collections, are they all from poems that you have seen that have been published, or do you ever go to a poet that you admire and say,
no,
would you write?
Yeah, that's something, you see, I started with these holiday house poems. I actually went to poets and I said, would you contribute a poem? I'd like to, an original poem, because a lot of times it happens to me too. Someone will write to me for like a big book for the planet, or the big book for peace. I'll get a letter, will you write a poem for this particular anthology? That doesn't mean you have to write a whole book. You can write one poem. And when that's what I would do. I would say, do you have anything you want to write on brothers or sisters or cats or dogs? And then I have people writing to me all the time, well, will you let me know what your next anthology would be, because I would like to send you something. Originally, I didn't do that with my older anthologies, and I did a great many, and I used very few children's poets in those too. It depends on the age, depends on what you're thinking. Like I Like You If You Like Me is a poem about friendship. For younger children, A Time to Talk is for teenagers.
That explains, because there were a couple of poets in the collections that I had not run across before at all.
No. But some of these people who started with me now are publishing their own books. So like Deborah Chandra, who is a very talented young woman, who did Balloon as and other poems, and has done one called Rich Lizard and other poems.
Well, obviously, because poetry is so, deals with the imagination and puts pictures in one's head, illustrations for books of poetry are very important. Do you have a favorite illustrator?
Well, I have two minds about that. For young children, yes, but I think when children get up to be around 9 or 10, I hope they make their own pictures. This is something that worries me about today's children, that they do not know how to make their own pictures anymore. They are so used to seeing television and make the pictures for them, or picture books make pictures for them, that they stop making their own. So I would rather have a book which is decorated, that does not have pictures on every page, which is true of, well, now, I Never Told has no pictures in it. No Way of Knowing has no pictures in it. The Malibu has a few poems, pictures in it, and so does Monkey Puzzle. These are more picture books. Celebrations, of course, is constantly illustrated, and so is the Space Songs and Earth Songs and Sea Songs. But these kinds of books just have a few illustrations, and they're decorations more than illustrations.
It was interesting to me that on Celebrations, because that particular title is a title of at least 3 books, and a child came in and said, I want Celebrations. And I said, well, which one? And she said, you know, the one with the balloons on the cover.
Oh, that's always nice to hear.
Which is your favorite of all your poems? And can you recite it for us?
Well, I don't know which my favorite is. It's probably a poem that I'm working on. You know, if you're talking about what's in a book, I have maybe 2 or 3 that I go back to, and I will say one for you because it's sort of, to me, typical of childhood. It's called For a Bird. I found him lying near the tree. I folded up his wings. Oh, little bird, you never heard the song the summer sings. I wrapped him in a shirt I wore in winter. It was blue. Oh, little bird, you never heard the song I sang for you. That's kind of a sad poem, isn't it? But to me, it typifies my childhood when the birds would fall down into the snow and we'd have a funeral. But I've written some serious poems. I like the one I wrote about Kennedy and the assassination of Kennedy. I like that one too.
Well, I thank you so much for being here and for sharing your time and your talents with us.
Oh, it's been a delight. It's been a delight to talk to you. And it's lovely to be in Minneapolis again. I think this is a particularly wonderful city.
Thank you. Come back anytime.
Thank you. Thank you. I accept.
All right. We'll see you again then.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lois.
Through her poetry, Myra Cohn Livingston helps children and adults see their world in new and different ways. Thank you, Myra Cohn Livingston and Lois Ringquist. Thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency.